Ola, good afternoon.
John, my friend, how are you?
Very good. And I'm saying good afternoon because where are you based out of these days?
I am in London
Oh my God, that is spectacular. And it's going to be a 1 year anniversary right next week.
next week. Crazy, isn't it? One whole year I've been here. It's just nuts.
That is spectacular. I think it just shows the breadth of ISG, and our offices are around the world and we're servicing clients everywhere. Maybe give a little background for our audience. This is our first show together, which we're super excited about. A little background on what you do at ISG and kind of your role here at the organization.
Yeah, happy to, John. Look, I've been with ISG for 9 years, as you know, and really began my career with ISG in our digital practice in the US. And so for 8 years, that's where I was. And then ISG offered me the opportunity to come over to Europe and to help them take over their digital business within North Europe. And so that's UK and I, the Nordics, and the Netherlands. Although, of course, I work across our entire EMEA region. And so our offices within the UK are in Guildford, which is a little south of the city. But many people informed me that all of the clients, or the majority of our clients, are in London, and that I would have a much better experience if I lived in the heart of London. And so therefore, here I am. So I'm very excited to be here. I've loved it. I'll be here for at least another year, and who knows? Who knows how long? I will stay as long as probably they'll let me.
That's fantastic. Well, thank goodness for this type of communication vehicle so you and I can have this show. And we'll be meeting every other week, roughly, depending on when holidays are, but we'll be meeting every other week and chatting about hot topics and things that are happening in the market. Maybe to kick things off, this show is let's talk a little bit about some of the data that Stanton Jones shared with us on the Index Insider. And for those of you who are not subscribing, it's free. Incredible information, incredible data. We'll give you the link in our comment section so you can subscribe. There's no cost, and it comes out every Friday. But last Friday, some really interesting data came out, Ola, and I'd love to get your perspective on what you see happening in Europe. And I can share a little bit about what we're seeing in the US, but we're at a 20-year high for the dollar, 40-year high from an inflation perspective. And I'd say we're in a recession, or in that midst of understanding what's exactly happening with regards to recession. So how are all those things impacting what you see with clients in Europe right now?
And I think another thing to recognize is that the economic landscape is a little different, of course, if you look at Europe and you look at the US, certainly. So we have some additional headwinds here, right? Obviously, the currency situation for Europe is quite different than what you would see in the States. And then you really can't talk about the economy without thinking about the Ukraine crisis. Energy costs certainly here are probably being impacted more than you would see in the U.S. As well. But I think for clients, what we see is what we would see probably globally, which is a little bit of the tapping of the brake, right? We're tapping the brakes a little bit. We're rethinking some of the things that we're doing in some sectors. But I also see organizations wanting to continue and indeed continuing on their transformation journeys. So interestingly, where we might have seen, if you think back to the first days of the pandemic, right, where there was a slamming of the brakes, right? Yeah. Everybody kind of slammed on the brakes, and then very quickly realized that, boy, that was probably the wrong move, and had to quickly kind of accelerate again in order to just, if nothing else, enable work from home and those sorts of things to be able to respond to it. I think what we're seeing here is more of a cautionary tale. Everyone recognizes that to completely slam on the brakes, it takes some time then to accelerate back up again. And so there's some tapping of the brakes happening. And I think we're seeing certainly a return after several probably years hiatus to a cost optimization view that some clients certainly have. But we also see that transformation can't stop. You've got, not just because of the fact that you've already spent some time and you have momentum moving, but also because you still have pressures from a competitive nature. Yeah. And you still have the need to get out of the technical debt that I think a lot of clients are in. So even though there's an economic headwind, there's a tailwind, which is continues to be customer experience, customer expectation, the needs of the marketplace, and new competitors that are entering the marketplace, which is why I think you'll see more of a tapping of the brakes a bit, perhaps. How's it in the U.S.?
US is interesting, and we actually did some surveys of CIOs and clients to try to understand like what they're seeing. And really, your point, it seems very similar to what's happening in Europe, and that is that it's really a shift in the investment, right? So they're looking at shorter term projects that are still impactful and digital, and tapping that brake a little bit on the longer term vision components, but it's not a complete stop like we saw at the beginning of COVID. The other component is really trying to figure out how do they optimize some of their processes and systems. Again, I don't want to say cost takeout. That always sounds like, well, it's not, we're not moving forward, but there is some cost takeout projects that we see happening, and people looking at doing that as well. You've also got a lot going on in Europe with regards to, is it 3:00 right now?
It is 2:00 in London.
2:00 in London. So who's the prime minister at 2:00 in London?
Let me go check.
So, you've got a lot happening with regards to leadership in Europe as well. And I'm really super impressed with the smoothness that Europe, kind of the UK, takes regarding leadership changes compared to the US. Do you see anything? You see it differently probably there.
Well, I think, I do think there's a smoothness to it. I think part of that is, the changes that have happened have not been between parties, which I think is probably, why it appears smooth and why it probably goes a bit smoother. I think now what we're seeing is, some welcome stability in terms of certainly how people are viewing, I think, the new prime minister. So I think that's good, but it doesn't lessen. And I think this is the critical thing. It still doesn't lessen the fact that you have, inflation, you have energy costs that are continuing to rise. You still have the same economic pressures. Changing to, a different government, if you will, doesn't really change what's impacting. It really is changing, I think, how are we reacting to it? What is it that we're intending to do as a government to help people through it? So while I think there have been some changes, I think those have been have had a stabilizing impact, I don't think they necessarily can do what they would probably like to do in terms of those inflationary pressures and those economic conditions that are just going to continue.
Yeah, that's it's a fair point. We have a different philosophy. It seems to be a little more aggressive in the U.S. right now. We're trying to figure out how to balance everything, regardless of the side you're on. It just seems a little toxic. But I have been impressed with how Europe is dealing with that, in the UK in general. Let's think a little bit about our enterprise clients. And okay, so now they're shifting some of their dollars, a little cost takeout, short-term projects. If you think about the best moves an enterprise client could think about making right now from a digital perspective, and you hinted to it with a little bit of that customer experience component, what is it that you'd spend your money on, and what would you be most nervous about with regards to competition in Europe?
I think, one of the big areas where we continue to see actually very little tapping of the brakes is in the retail sector. And a lot of that has to do with a couple of different things. Somewhat it has to do with this customer demand and the demand for digitization of the channels that they have as consumers. But there's also sort of organizations that have largely been in a business, in a B2B sort of mode for quite some time, and are attempting to shift their attention to more of a direct-to-consumer mode, which requires them to have a digital connection. The customers are no longer wandering the streets, right, looking for the next retail brick-and-mortar store to walk into. They're wandering across the web and saying, what's available for me out there. So I do think that there's continues to be a whole lot of transformation that's happening there. CPG would be another area where, look, particularly as we see supply chain impacts that are happening across Europe and frankly across the world, whether it's from China or elsewhere. We see I'll call it maybe trend toward localization in terms of the supply base. That also comes along with the need for my supply chain to be very resilient and to have a lot of agility in my ability to switch suppliers or to choose suppliers or to make sure that my suppliers and that requires us to transform, in many cases, our supply chain technology. because our supply chain technology in many of these CPG organizations has been relatively, let's just say, oil slicked for a specific, supply base. So suddenly we get to more local suppliers. Maybe we have more suppliers in our supply chain. Wow, we've got to make sure that our systems that enable those partners or those vendors or those suppliers in our supply chain to be able to easily plug and unplug into our specific needs. That means I've got to transform that capability technologically. So it's interesting in the consumer direct or the customer space, we see a whole lot of transformation continuing. And it's maybe in the other spaces that we can see the tapping of the brakes a little more, maybe, even banking and financial services, maybe, insurance, areas that we really saw highly invested in looking at transformation, maybe are slowing down a little bit, simply because I think those other sectors really require it in order to stay relevant in the market.
Yeah, well, I think that's a really interesting point. I think retail, CPG, the investments are there. Even during this downturn, you're seeing the ConAgras and other large craft and Heinz Craft, they're holding their own, because at the end of the day, we still need to consume. They've got supply chain challenges, but those investments are being made. The banking one is really interesting because I think Europe's done a really great job of bringing on digital banks. Yeah. So how is that brick and mortar bank making that shift to compete in that space? I've seen a lot of work in that area. How are they making it? Because there's regulation, there's all these pieces that create challenges to make that innovation. What are your thoughts there?
I mean, I saw this in the U.S. Prior to coming over as well. Look, it's harder to make changes to my specific direct-to-consumer channels as a organization that already has heritage ways of doing business. Yeah. It's harder to make those changes than if I'm a new entrant to the market. So these new banks, these digital banks that come into being are actually in a much better position to be able to quickly connect with consumers, right, and customers, which is why you see, the Monzos of the world suddenly come on the scene and take over a really big portion of particularly consumer relationships. Now, I think traditional banks, traditional financial services continue to have the majority of let's call it the big relationships, the relationships with companies and the relationships with even with the public sector. So I don't think that there's any kind of magic to it, other than do you go with a predefined solution that's already available for you in the market as a bank to be able to enable that direct to consumer channel, and some banks do that. Or do you go through maybe a bespoke way of trying to connect to your customer? The good news is that those micro banks, those smaller banks that frankly aren't micro anymore, but they're new, right? They came onto the market relatively new, have already tripped the majority of the regulatory bombs or the mines that are in the market, right? So I think the big banks can learn from that, right? They can learn what they already see happening with that competitive landscape. So I think they have a challenge, certainly in the direct-to-consumer landscape, particularly with the younger, maybe the millennials, right, and younger, because they're far more interested in mobile banking and that sort of thing, rather than those traditional banks. But I still think it's a challenge, because you have your core banking systems in those traditional banks are heritage. They've been around for a long time. They're sitting on mainframes, right? I mean, that's a real challenge, I think.
I mean, that mainframe was plugged in 1972. Yeah. And it's worked since then. So it sounds simpler than it is to say we're going to unplug that and move it to the cloud. I was with a CEO of a digital bank in Europe a few months ago, and I was blown away because they started on server. And it took them about 24 months to get it up and running, this bank. And they realized very quickly, within less than a year, that they needed to move this to the cloud for tons of reasons. They started and rebooted, and they could, because they were only less than 2 years old. And they took down, and 18 months later, were back up and running as a digital bank, but running from the cloud. And I think that's where the Bank of Americas and the Chase of the world, it's not quite as easy, right? Because they've been doing something really well for a really long time, and to make that shift is really hard. There's a lot that will be shared November 15th in New York City at our BFSI event, Banking and Financial Services Insurance Conference. So if you have got the opportunity, you're in the area, I would encourage you to attend that event. Definitely some awesome speakers and perspectives from both ISG, our enterprise clients, et cetera. All right, so let's move over to travel, transportation, hospitality. How is the recession, the dollar? I mean, you must be traveling all over the place in Europe thanks to this, right?
Well, I wish I could say, boy, I travel every day. Of course I don't, right? I think clients in particular, I think, and enterprise clients have recognized that, they don't need consultants and service providers or advisors sitting in their offices to be able to get work done. On the flip side, we have a lot of change that have happened, that has happened really in most organizations, if only due to the war on the war for talent, right? Yeah. And a lot of talent shifts that have happened. Attrition's gotten better, but look, it's still high. In not only in our service providers, but in our enterprise clients. And so there's a lot of new joiners that happen within enterprises. And when those new joiners join, we're finding that they're a little slower on the uptake than they might have been if they were joining in a traditional setting where they're actually, in the actual location with the client. And because of that, I think clients are starting to open up and recognize that, at least in early days of engagements, that they really do need to have some support on site, even if it's only, again, just in early days, just as you're kind of getting things started. And so we are seeing a lot more travel happen, a lot more business travel happen, but recognize that prices are going up. So I think that's also going to maybe keep a little bit of a lid on things. I think we're still going to see more travel, obviously, than we did last year, and we're continuing to see that. I'm not sure, depending on how things, frame up in the new year. The real question is going to be, how much travel are we going to see over the holiday period, and then how much travel are we actually going to see over the spring and the summer? And I think jury's still out on that one.
Yes, I listen to Scott Galloway and Kara Swisher. I think they're two really smart people. Scott brought up something last week that got me a little nervous. It was related to Twitter and, the layoffs that will happen at Twitter, whether it's going to be 25% or 70%. And his prediction was that is going to be a telltale sign of what Instagram and Snapchat and all this tech is going to be doing as we get into Q1. So my question becomes is January through April, May, oh my God, to hire somebody was almost impossible, right? I mean, India, we had, huge inflation to keep people. We were losing people, gaining people. I mean, the fluidity of the whole thing was crazy to get talent. But now all of a sudden, do you think there'll be a hard switch in January, or do you think it's still going to be a talent war?
I think there's still going to be a bit of a talent war. I think two things are going to start happening. I mean, one, I think if you look at some of the indicators that we've seen, I mean, HBR, I think, did a really great body of work around looking at people who have moved jobs in the last year or two and asking them if they're happier having moved jobs. And the numbers were kind of surprising, I think, for a lot of people. Many of those folks who moved positions to a new company are no happier than they were at the previous company, right? So they all thought, ooh, I'm going to move to, a new position. The grass is going to be greener. And of course they found the grass was just as brown as it was from where they went from, right? So, but having said that, most organizations, because of the high attrition, have spent an awful lot of time and money in investing in retention. Yeah. And because they've invested a lot of time and money and effort in retention, I think that's actually helped our attrition, which is why I think it's still high, but it's not nearly as bad as it was maybe a year ago. So I think that's gonna have some impact on, are we suddenly going to see a huge rise in attrition again because we see this influx of talent in the market? Potentially. I mean, that could happen, but I tend to think it's going to be a slower roll into the market of that particular sector of people who might be moving into the market. Look, what happens. Someone leaves Twitter, they have great capability and they can go find a job elsewhere. The difference, I think, in what happened previously was someone left, let's just say a large technology firm, and they left behind a position. Yeah. That's not happening in Twitter. And so when they left behind a position, it opened a position, which meant someone from another company moved into that position, which opened a position there. It generated, I think, some of the, there's a lot of open positions. I should go try for those. I think this is obviously, should it happen, going to increase the availability of talent in the marketplace rather than vice versa. So I think there may be that. I think that's going to steady things out, in my opinion.
I think that's where, Ola, that's exactly it. To me, I think Scott's onto something. Is I think the supply of talent will grow significantly in Q1,
Yes.
right?
Yep.
So that's good news for enterprise clients. It's good news for firms like ourselves where we're growing and we're going to be looking for talent. I think that talent opportunity is going to be out in the marketplace. So I think you're spot on that. That door is not available for somebody else. When they leave Twitter, they're not replacing that. And I think we're going to see that happen with some of these other tech firms, the unicorns. We have a question from our listeners. They want a perspective on manufacturing, and there's so much amazing manufacturing that happens in Europe. What are we seeing in a digital world and manufacturing right now? Is that slowing? How's inflation hitting that? What do you see?
Look, I think manufacturing, the movement to Industry 4.0, smart manufacturing, digital engineering, those are all happening in that sector. I don't see any slowdown. In fact, I still see speeding up. And part of the reason is because I think most have started to recognize the underlying benefit and return on investment to that digital transformation that's happening. And where we see organizations really investing is in, I'll just simplistically call it the data and integration layer. So where you see information technology and maybe engineering technology, or even the operational technology within the manufacturing, the line operations, and where you see data start to be used in a really smart way, again, very smart manufacturing way of trying to predict what's happening either along the line in the manufacturing line itself, or even post-production, where you start to see quality control being able to be predicted by analytics that are available should you gather the right amount of information. So where we're seeing things like digital twins start to happen within that realm, IoT is starting to really take off in most of these organizations. How they operate as firms is also being really impacted by this intent that we see a connection between what used to be thought of as back office, selling product, production of product, engineering of product. All of those things are really starting to come together from maybe a data and analytics perspective. And I think that's driving a great return on investment, and manufacturers are seeing that. And because of that, I think they're going to continue to push the envelope on IoT, on Industry 4.0, on smart manufacturing. I don't see that really slowing down. Where they may slow down is some areas where it may seem a little far out, like a little out there. They may do some of that. But if they've already begun, as an example, a digital twin type of investment, they're probably not going to stop it. They're probably going to continue on with that investment. That's the sense I get.
Ola, I think you're spot on, and that's what we're seeing in the U.S. One of the things, I was with a service provider a couple weeks ago, and they had a client there they were working with a blender, making small appliances. Here's the key thing I was blown away by. It was about smart manufacturing and taking 30% of the carbon footprint out of the manufacturing process, because everyone thought like, oh, well, we'll lower the electricity that small appliance utilizes. Actually, it was around the entire, from getting the minerals to make the product, to manufacturing it, and then the disposal of that product at end of life and recycling. Ola, I think this ESG component to manufacturing is such a hot topic. What are your thoughts?
It's huge in Europe. And let's not forget, it's not just that it's huge for the manufacturers. There's a reason for that, right? Some governments are actually starting to put in place, actual measurements and requirements and regulation around some aspects of ESG. And as we see that continue to increase, it's something that we should probably spend, if not one show, John, maybe multiple shows, talking about all the different aspects that we see happening, because I think it is probably of higher interest in Europe, mainly because the regulatory aspects that are coming, particularly within the EU, but frankly, all over Europe. And I know that it's still of concern to many global organizations, but when you have a regulatory and regulation around it, that obviously puts a higher profile around it and introduces risk if you're not at least ticking the box on it.
Well, and
So
I think it's regulation, but I also think I'm impressed. I think the consumer is helping drive some of
oh,
this.
no question. No question. Yeah, don't get me wrong. In fact, I think that's what's happening in the supply chain as well. As you see, as I was talking earlier about the movement to more local markets, some of that
Yeah.
isn't driven by supply chain disruption. Some of that's driven by consumer demand. Consumers are
Yeah.
demanding that they have, and they want to know where their actual produce is coming from. They want to know, in the CPG sense, where did you get these products from? And the similar thing can be said about ESG. Customers want to know just how responsible you're being in terms of all aspects of ESG. So yeah, I think
Yeah,
it's a
I
fascinating
get a kick
subject.
out of this. Like there's fads like, the Atkins diet and all these fads, but I don't think like saving the planet is a
This
fad.
is
Like,
not a fad. I hope it's not.
I don't think everybody's going to wake up in 2023 and say, you know what, we were going to try to save the planet, but I think we're going to tap out and go back to straws.
Yeah,
I
totally
think
agree.
they're actually, yeah, they're totally into it. So that's kind of exciting. Hey, listen, we've got another question here. I don't know if we're going to have time to answer it today, so we could always bring it up in another topic because we're going to run short. But somebody's asking about BFSI and Dora and the impact of that on, on the overall banking. What are your thoughts on that? Do you have any perspective?
Oh, I could talk for hours. I could talk for hours on any subject, but particularly that one, right? I mean, because the state of DevOps today within most environments is really necessary in order to
Yeah.
respond quickly to the market. And I think it's part of the change that we're seeing, particularly in traditional banking and financial services, because in order to do that connection correctly with the consumer, my ability to be able to respond to them very quickly and respond to, frankly, competitive conditions within the market very quickly is really important. So I do believe that as we see DevOps become the preferred way of doing business, particularly in direct-to-consumer channels, that it's going to get more and more important for our traditional organizations, whether it's banking, financial service, insurance, whoever it is, who are now exploring these channels to change the way they work. And that is largely a cultural change for many organizations. So operating model changes, I think, are going to be prevalent. I think that's going to be a big part of what organizations are going to have to turn their minds to and turn their investments to, is recognizing that there's a change that needs to happen within the way that they work internally in order to enable that speed to market that they need with their end consumers.
I love it, and we definitely will have to get back on that. We'll find a show. Listen, in 2 weeks we're going to be back, November 17th. The format will be on several shows. We'll have a guest. So we're looking for CIOs or senior executives to come on and ask questions about what's happening, what they see, or in the marketplace. Leadership. I think ESG will be a hot topic. As we end today's episode, what I'd love to know is, what are you most excited about, either on a personal level or on a professional level right now? What are you most excited about?
So when I moved to London a year ago, as you said earlier, a year ago next week, we were still in lockdown.
Yeah.
So there was the traditional London Christmas that I didn't really get to experience, right? They have a lot of Christmas shows that happen, a lot of proms that happen. I did get to the Christmas market last year, but everyone had, masks on, and it was just not quite probably the same experience. So I am just incredibly excited about being in London at Christmas, right? Our ability to be able to go out and see a lot of the Christmas programs that are events that are on, as well as the Christmas markets. Big player in my mind is to be able to get to those. So I'm really excited about that, John.
Oh, that's awesome, Ola. I love it. That sounds like a great thing. I'm actually very envious. I would like to get to those Christmas markets. I think I'm most excited right now is, on a personal level, is the weather in New England has been incredible. It was 70 degrees yesterday in Connecticut. On November 2nd. I mean, we just, if there's any question around global warming, that was the answer.
That was it.
Yeah, that was it. But frankly, we took advantage of it. It's so I'm definitely excited about that. And then on a work perspective, I had an opportunity yesterday to meet with senior executives at a healthcare provider. And I am inspired by where digital transformation is, what they're doing to make the patient experience better, because we're all going to be a patient at some point. And to think that healthcare is utilizing technology to make that experience better really was inspiring. So I'm really excited about that, and am hopeful of what to see next. This has been great, Ola. Thank you so much. And I can't wait to see you in 2 weeks.
See you then.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.